Matthew chapter 7, verse 24, that the wise people put into practice Jesus' teaching. The foolish do not. Making the faithful move from listening to doing is difficult and a lifelong effort. Where are you today in putting Jesus' ways into practice in your life? In today's scripture, Mark chapter 6, verses 31 through 44, Jesus shows us a pattern of faithful living when dealing with a difficulty. Then, because so many people were coming and going that they did not even have a chance to eat, he said to them, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." So they went away by themselves in a boat to a solitary place. But many who saw them leaving recognized them and ran on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things. By this time it was late in the day, so his disciples came to him. "This is a remote place," they said, "and it's already very late. Send the people away so that they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat." But he answered, "You give them something to eat." They said to him, "That would take more than half a year's wages. Are we to go and spend that much on bread and give it to them to eat?" "How many loaves do you have?" he asked. "Go and see." When they found out, they said, 5, and 2 fish. Then Jesus directed them to have all the people sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups of hundreds and 50s. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to his disciples to distribute to the people. He also divided the 2 fish among them all. They all ate and were satisfied. And the disciples picked up 12 baskets of broken pieces of bread and fish. The number of the men who had eaten was 5,000. The word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God. I'm glad that you're here the first Sunday of the year. How many of y'all have made New Year's resolutions? Wow. First service was pretty scant too. Got 1 or 2. No New Year's resolutions. I wonder if that's changing like in our culture in some way. Choir, did y'all make any New Year's resolutions? Well, you don't have to have made New Year's resolutions to kind of focus on what we're focusing on this month. The series of Building the Good Life tries to use the momentum of the beginning of the year and things starting. And even if you're not a resolution person, the idea is to pick up with that energy that is somewhere in our culture about starting things anew. Building the Good Life is a focus on the walk of Christ and what it means, mostly in terms of a base level, reinforcing some of the basics of the Christian way of living and of how God intended us to be. I would offer to you that it's a constant challenge in our culture to not get caught up in all the other noise and difficulty and distraction. I wonder if you can hear verse 31, Jesus say, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest. I wonder if 2020 might be one of those times where we were able to take at least that step and perhaps other steps as well. There is a thing in our culture called the American dream, and I think most often, at least for myself, I think of that having to do with housing, and that people desire to own their own home, and certainly if not that, to just have good shelter. I think it extends beyond that, the American dream, to other things. And the American dream can also be the American nightmare, depending on the details of how that rolls. This is a picture of one of my favorite comics, Baby Blues, and that's Daryl. He's the dad. And he's laying awake in bed, and those two little dots just above his big nose are his eyes that are wide open, and he's not sleeping. And the caption says, 5 people divided by 2 bathrooms. We need a bigger house, he says. And then in the next one, he's still wide awake. 3 different thoughts going through his head, just bang, bang, bang. I wonder if you've ever been laying in bed with different thoughts just kind of popping in and out of your head. How will we ever afford to send 3 kids to college? I wonder if we can wait until payday to get the car's brakes fixed. Maybe we shouldn't have gotten the adjustable rate mortgage. I imagine throughout our culture, throughout the world, that people lay awake wondering about the things that have them tense and stirred up. These are certainly representative of some common ones, I would think. His wife turns next to him. I guess she's finally stirred and says, "Daryl, are you still awake?" He says, "Yes." And ironically, I can't sleep because we're living the American dream. Living the American dream. So obviously, he hasn't heard Jesus say, "Come with me by yourself to a quiet place and get some rest." Dad is tense. He's understandably tense for all the things that are going on in his life. And his tension, I would say, is a result of at least 2 things, maybe more, that he didn't follow his plan or their plan. Or the plan that was in place was a terrible plan. And it's brought about all of the tension and all of those things that bother us and keep us awake at night. One of the things that is true, particularly about who our God is that God's plan is a good plan. It's the best plan. It's the perfect plan. And yet we struggle to live into that. We've always struggled to live into that. It's not going to change much in 2020. And in part, the struggle is to live in such a way that we hear Jesus say, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." This is a typical home, 4 different shots of the same thing. This would be a plan that ideally would be sketched out, and you'd have full architectural plans before you went forward with building one of those houses. If you have a keen eye for architecture, you'll know that these 2 really aren't related. I just got them off the interweb somewhere. But that's a plan, and the idea before you build the good life would be to figure out if you have the very best plan, or if you have any plan at all. But the truth is that we don't get to start from ground zero. We're all born into a plan that's already rolling. We're born into a country. We're born into a city, a county, area. We're born into families. We're born into what is a fixer-upper. We're all born into a fixer-upper. And if our fixer-upper hasn't been used to listening and responding, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest," well, we might not pick up on that. Maybe not for a long time, or maybe not at all. One of the things that happens with plans, with all plans, is that there's an architect, keeping with the building theme, there's an architect that makes those plans, and then there's a builder that builds those plans, that takes those plans and puts them into practice. And God has benevolently, although sometimes in a very challenging way, said, "You get to build. You're the builder of this life. I want you to build this life, and I have the plan here, and I want to help guide you step by step into this good life." And thus comes the forever fight between the architect and the builder. This is a non sequitur comic, and that's a picture of a castle down at the very bottom where there should be a drawbridge, and the drawbridge has been attached up instead of down. And the king is at the door, and he's looking to the right, and at the right of him, on our left, stands the builder. And the builder says, "Oh, what? Okay, I see. The problem is, I see what the problem is now. It's the architect's fault." And thus begins that constant battle between the architect and the builder. Does anybody here have experience with an architect and a builder in that? It's a pretty common thing that the one who makes the plan would argue with the one who wants to build the plan, and vice versa about all of that. We can really set that aside as people of faith because we have the perfect plan. The trouble is all those barriers that spring up, come up, or that we're somehow born into that keep us from either understanding or stepping more and more into the plan that God has offered and given to us. There are all kinds of things that we inherit. I think of the things that all of us are living in the aftermath of things hundreds of years ago. Lots of good things, and yet some difficult things. I think particularly of slavery and its effect in our country and the difficulty of the Civil War. I think of Jim Crow laws. I think of particularly what happens in Christian community and what I would call checkmark Christianity. Checkmark Christianity is my focus is on the checkmark that I believe sits on that register, and so when I get to the pearly gates, there will be a checkmark by my name. It kind of has this pagan sort of feel to it of I have mine, and I'm going to be okay, so I'm not really worried about becoming more and more Christ-like. I'm not really worried about much else because I've got mine. Checkmark Christianity. You were born into it in some way, shape, or form. You can't not be in this culture. The other aspect of Christianity, I would say, that has difficulty hearing, come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest, is just a version of cultural Christianity that takes on the practices of the culture at any given time. Rather than helping to shape the culture, we say that our Christian expression is wrapped up in it. Not that we claim it. Think more of a liberal conservative thing that happens in our country right now and the animosity between those. And so we Christians take on, not politically necessarily, but it could include that, something that is with great animosity towards another group. And so we gather with those that think like us, and we point at the ones that don't think like us, and it takes our focus off of where it's designed to be, which is up here. We'll always have disagreements. There will always be two sides of every sort of issue, but our focus as people of faith is at that cross. Cultural Christianity. I used the pie pan last Sunday to talk about God's design and desire. It's just another way to think about it, that the pie pan has God's name on it, and it is a plan about how life should look and be, and it has boundaries, and at the very core and foundation is God. And all of our life together, my life, your life, it lives here, and it grows and is supported and held in this way. But the truth of where we are and who we are is that my name, your name, is on that pie pan. And growing from this to this is a struggle. And yet, that's part of this plan. Moving from here to here would include hearing this call of Jesus, come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest. One of the things that happens here when I think of building the good life, I think about what it is that I'm going to have in my piece of pie. And oftentimes we're encouraged that this piece of pie, or really the pie pan, it needs to grow bigger. We need more and more, fill in the blank. And that determines our well-being, our value. It determines whether we're content in life or not. In the architect's plan, our contentment is not connected to our circumstances. Our value is not connected to our circumstances. We live in them, we always will, but this Jesus guy who says, come with me by yourself to a quiet place and get some rest. This Jesus teaches us how to live with God as the foundation, no matter what our circumstances are, and not always hoping that our circumstances are going to get better and better and better. They might. It's not a bad thing to seek that, but that's not the core and the foundation of who we're called to be. You might have heard the fisherman's story. It's been around a long time. There was a businessman who was vacationing on the beach in some exotic place. He was strolling along that beach, and he came upon a fisherman who had finished for the day. It was mid-morning, and the fisherman was reclining by his boat, a very simple sort of boat. And the businessman came up and said, "Why aren't you out there fishing?" And the businessman said, businessman said, "Why aren't you fishing?" The response was, "I've caught all the fish I need today." And the businessman said, "Well, you could catch more fish. You could go out there and catch more fish." "Why would I do that?" said the fisherman, relaxing on the beach. He said, "Well, you start off by getting more fish, and then you sell more fish. And you sell more fish, and you can buy a nicer, bigger, more adequate boat if you need. And you can buy the stuff that needs to go in the boat in order to catch more fish. You catch more fish, you sell more fish. As you sell more fish, you're able to buy more boats, and you could hire people, and you could have a fleet of boats in just a matter of time, and before long, you would be rich like me." And then the fisher says, "And then what would I do?" And the businessman says, "Well, then you could relax on the beach." Do you get a sense of whose name is on the bottom of that pan in each one of those characters? That normal thing that is so prolific in our world, and one who perhaps has heard Jesus say, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." And so in our text today, they're on and by the Sea of Galilee. They're not fishing, but they have been. And they go to the other side of the sea. They're followed by folk, lots of folk, 5,000 men, so we know there's several thousand more of women and children there. Huge horde. Jesus sees them. He begins to teach them. It gets late. Everybody's hungry. And there's a pattern here, a life pattern, and you find these so often in Jesus' teachings, the stories or the parables. There's a life pattern, and it's really not rocket science. I don't expect anybody will hear this pattern and say, "Oh, that's it." It's a simple thing. It's almost so simple it's kind of hard to do. There's an issue here that folk are hungry. Verse 36 and 35. All these people are here, and we don't have food for them. The first thing we have to focus on very often in dealing with any sort of difficulty is to just admit that we have a need. Admit that something needs to change. admit that on the pie pan of my life is my name that overshadows God's name. And I desire for that to be different. The next thing they do is take stock of where they are, what they have. Do you have any food? Go and see. They find 5 loaves and 2 fish. And then we're taught here, as in other places, to do that primary thing that we particularly show in the sacrament, that we lift it to God. We take our problems, we assess those problems where we are, and we lift those to God. It's a life pattern. Jesus takes the loaves and the fish, he gives thanks, and he breaks the loaves, and he gives it to them, and they were satisfied. And they picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces of bread and fish. The last piece of that, after we give it to God, we trust what God will do with that. That's probably the hardest part, because if you're like me, I already know what I want. I already know what I want. I don't really want to trust God with, I just want God to give me what I want. But trust means that I give up that particular thing that I might want, and I say, God, not my will, but yours. What would it mean for you in 2020 to trust God even more? If you were here last Sunday, you know that there are these little pie pans, basket here and a basket there, and invite you to grab one or several, just as a reminder as you move into 2020. You could write your name there. You could put God's name there. You could put a family name there. You could put a question mark there. It's just something that is intended to help you ask the question. Ask the question that is always before us. Gracious God, how do I move from the one more towards the other? And we would trust that God will help us in that in ways that perhaps we can't even imagine, the blessedness, the goodness of how God will do that. Will you pray with me? Gracious God, we give you thanks this day for the outpouring of your graciousness in our lives, for how you've created us to be, and for the blessings of your attentiveness. We give you thanks for the goodness. We even give you thanks for the struggles and the opportunity to walk through difficulty with you. Each time that is upon us is yet another time for us to trust you. Open our hearts this day and speak your word to us, reminding us of where we are and how you seek to draw us more and more to you. As your gathered people, we seek for 2020 to be one of those years that brings unexpected blessings for you and your kingdom as well as for ourselves. We ask all of this in the name of your Son, our Savior, Jesus, and all God's people said, amen.